Philip K. Dick's of Withered Apples, which was published in 1954, was part of a very strange phase that he went through as a writer, where he was writing about sexual relations between women and either these alien beings, supernatural beings, inanimate objects. And this phase lasted, it went from 1953 to 1954. And so this short story in particular is about a woman who is constantly trying to escape, trying to get away from this very repressive, and I guess you could argue, patriarchal marriage. A husband that is emotionally very distant, very cold, very controlling, constantly trying to monitor her behavior, needing to know where she is, etc. And one night, though, she comes across a tree that seems to act as, you're not even really sure what it is exactly. It has obviously a very paranormal presence, its own kind of intelligence that you can't really explain. There's no real way that you can account for anything that's happening. It moves on its own, in a way that is more human, that is more lifelike than anything that she's experienced before, and she ends up having basically a sexual relationship with it. And you can't really tell whether it's a hallucination, a vision of some kind, or you don't know whether it's a kind of escapism, something that her mind has created as a way to get out of a lot of the suffering that she's experiencing in her own marriage. And after she eats one of the withered apples from the tree, it's a decaying tree, which even makes it even more disturbing that it has very much an intelligent life of its own. She ends up dying. She dies of appendicitis as a result. And it raises a lot of questions of how much he's staying within his own genre of science fiction, and how much of it really extends into a reality, like many of the other short stories, that is completely incomprehensible. That you could argue is metaphysical, it is spiritual. I'm not necessarily going to make any assumptions that this is going along with his usual line of thinking of something that has an extraterrestrial or a technological or biological explanation. And he experiments a lot with this concept. And this is, as I've mentioned many times before, another one of his sort of Kafka-esque kind of detours that he likes to take. A very funny and very disturbing kind of tale that reminds me, whenever I read it, what it often reminds me of, whenever people combine these different layers and genres in this way, it reminds me of this sculpture I've seen many times, and unfortunately I can't remember the name of it, but it resembles two masks that are put together side by side. One is a smiling face, looks almost like a Joker face, and the other one is an unhappy face. And they're put right next to each other. And it was a symbol that was used for the theater in many cases, of tragedy and comedy, of these different dualities being put together. And so whenever he combines the dark and the absurd, and also the very mystical and the beautiful all put together, to me it creates just a perfect storm of all of these different things. And that's often something that I try to aspire to in my own writing, and I think is actually a very difficult thing to pull off. And I've even tried it before. Generally, particularly when I create dream sequences, I won't go on too much of a tangent, but I mean, when I've described the character, there's a character, Anastasia, in my own novel, a spiritual, supernatural being who enters many of one of the protagonist, Adrian's, dreams. And there's always these very frivolous, very playful kind of encounters, but there's always a very dark undertone to it. And what Philip K. Dick does here is he takes that kind of technique, but of course he takes it a few steps up. I'm definitely not really at that stage yet. As a writer, I think I've really been able to master that. But it's also, of course, aside from the absurdity of it, it does illustrate a lot of things about, I think, his culture back then. I mean, even the patriarchal marriage, it did make me feel a lot of what the woman was going through. And that sense of wanting an escape, of wanting, trying to create a virtual reality that is deliberately absurd in a certain way, because ordinary life has become so unbearable that and I think that this is the role of absurdism and satire in general. I mean, you see this in Through the Looking Glass and Alice in Wonderland, that absurdity almost has a kind of idyllic quality about it. There's something that actually feels very liberating. That sense of not letting go of needing any kind of self-importance, feeling like you need to have any certainty about things, and just being able to, and like in Alice in Wonderland, there's always something a bit charming about being even in a total predicament, something that you have no control over, no understanding of. And that is also something that has really enchanted me, I think, about this particular story. Because even as a sci-fi writer, absurdism in other things such as Kafka and Eugene Ionesco, a French playwright, have appealed to me a great deal as I was growing up. And here's another story that I would not say, even though it's maybe not one of his strongest. I mean, I think ultimately he's the best when he gets more into dystopian and more philosophical themes. I would, however, recommend it just from that particular angle. If you're interested in writing that tends to combine all of those very dissonant kind of elements and puts them together in that way, I would recommend it.